They called it Falernian, the richest wine in Rome. Sweet as honey, dark as a bruise. I carried it in clay jars that sweated against my palms, the cool damp hiding the heat of my own hands. The arena floor was still slick from the last match, the sand clumped in little red islands where blood had refused to dry. Somewhere beneath it, the dead were already cooling. I was 16, and my job was simple: keep the cups full. A gladiator could not walk into the sun with a dry throat, even if the wine was the last thing he would taste. Some drank quickly, tilting their heads back as if swallowing the day itself. Others sipped slowly, rolling the liquid over their tongues like they had time to decide. One smiled at me. That was worse than the ones who didn't look at all. They say the crowd comes for the fight, but I think they come for the moment just before, the hush between cup and sword, between breath and blood. I learned, in those moments, that service has its own kind of violence, and that pouring wine for men who will die is nothing like serving the living. What I did not know then was that one of those cups would be the last thing I ever touched. They told me to carry it like a child, not by the neck, never the neck, but cradled in both arms so the clay would not chip, so the wine would not tremble inside. The amphora was taller than my torso, its belly warm from the sun, its handles worn smooth by other hands before mine. When I first lifted it, I felt the strain deep in my ribs, as if it pressed against my lungs from the inside. The corridor to the arena was not straight. It bent and dipped, winding between storage rooms and holding cells, forcing me to adjust the jar every few steps. My shoulders ached before I'd gone halfway, but I didn't dare rest. The floor beneath me was damp with more than spilled drink, a thin film of water from the aqueduct channels above mixed with the dark streaks that no one scrubbed away. The smell was the first thing that made me dizzy. Not the wine, though Falernian has its own way of climbing into your head, but the air itself. It carried 3 scents at once: the sweet, heavy perfume of fermented grapes, the sharp, metallic tang of iron, and something darker, like meat left too long in the sun. That was my first day in the Colosseum. I had not yet seen the sand. I had not yet heard the roar of 50,000 voices turning a man's death into music. But I had already learned that the place was not built for comfort. It was built for hunger, theirs, ours, Rome's. I was 16, old enough to lift the amphora, young enough to think the job was an honor. My uncle had arranged it. Better than working the tanner's vats, he'd said, as if the stench of boiling leather was the only thing I needed saving from. What he didn't say was that pouring wine in the Colosseum was not like serving in a tavern. You were not part of the noise, you were part of the silence before it. When I finally reached the preparation chamber, my arms quivered. A line of men stood against the far wall, not standing exactly, but leaning in ways that disguised their exhaustion. They were dressed for the arena, their armor catching the light in dull glints. Some had helmets tucked under their arms, others held wooden practice swords with edges darkened from old oil. The first man I ever poured for was taller than the others, his chest bare except for the leather straps crossing his torso. His face was pale under the dust, lips cracked. When I tipped the amphora, the stream caught the light, deep red with a gold sheen, the mark of true Falernian. It was said to be the best wine in the empire, grown on the slopes of Mount Falernus where the sun baked the vines until the grapes swelled like blood blisters. Only the wealthy drank it often. For the rest, it was a festival rarity, a wedding toast. In the arena, it was given to men who might not live to taste water again. He drank quickly, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. I expected him to hand the cup back. Instead, he held it out again, tapping it lightly with one finger. I poured more. His eyes didn't meet mine. Next, one of the handlers barked, and I moved on. The second man didn't drink at all. He cupped the wine in his hands and poured it over his head, letting it run through his hair and down his back. I thought it was wasteful until I saw his lips moving, whispering something to the gods. The wine was not for his thirst, it was for their attention. That was the first time I noticed no one called it serving, they called it offering. The wine was not refreshment, it was ritual, a thing to be seen holding. A thing to stain your lips with before your blood stained the sand. Some took it like medicine, swallowing without pleasure. Others savored it, swishing it in their mouths as if pretending they were in a villa by the sea. One man, barely older than me, tipped his head back, let the wine rest on his tongue, and smiled. Not at me, not at anyone. Just smiled into the air like the taste had carried him somewhere far away from the noise and the heat. That smile stayed with me for years. The chain sound came next, the rattle of gates being drawn back somewhere below. The handlers began moving the men toward the arena ramp, their cups now empty or abandoned on the ground. My job was done until the next group came in, but I stood there, frozen, the amphora still heavy in my arms. One of the handlers noticed and jerked his chin toward the exit. "Back to the storeroom," he said. "Don't get caught in the flow." The flow, that was what they called the tide of bodies moving toward the sand. It was not a march, it was not a procession. It was something in between, as if each man was both walking toward his end and being carried there by the will of the crowd waiting above. I turned back down the corridor, my feet slipping slightly on the damp stone. The amphora pressed harder into my ribs now, as if it had grown heavier from the sips and spills it had lost. My arms shook, but I held on. I remembered my uncle's warning, if the jar breaks, so do you. Somewhere above, I could hear the muffled pulse of voices, not yet a roar, but rising, like water boiling in a sealed pot. I wondered how many of those voices had ever tasted what was in my arms. I wondered how many would remember it if they had. The storeroom was cooler, lit by a narrow slit of sunlight that cut the air like a blade. Amphorae lined the walls in uneven stacks, each marked with a painted symbol, a vine, a bird, a laurel wreath, telling the handlers what they carried without having to read. Mine had a faded sunburst, the sign for Falernian. I set it carefully on the stone floor, the thud echoing in the quiet. My arms felt hollow, light, almost as if they no longer belonged to me. For a moment I just stood there, listening to the muffled crowd, smelling the ghost of wine on my skin. It struck me then I had not spoken a single word since I entered the Colosseum. No one had asked my name, no one had told me theirs. I existed only as a pair of hands, a steady pour, a weight-bearer between the cellar and the sand. Later I would understand that the weight I carried was not just clay and liquid. It was time. Time for the men to think or not think, time to swallow something sweet before swallowing dust, and it was mine to give or to take away. I left the storeroom with empty arms, feeling heavier than when I arrived. Outside, in the sunlit courtyard where supplies came in from the city, I caught my reflection in a bronze shield leaning against a wall. Sweat darkened my tunic, my hair clung to my forehead, and my eyes, they looked older than they had that morning. I did not know yet that the amphora would never feel lighter. I did not know that some of the men I poured for would start to recognize me, and that recognition would be worse than being invisible. All I knew was the ache in my shoulders, the sour, sweet scent in my nostrils, and the echo of chains in my ears. I thought of my uncle again. Better than the tanner's vats, he had said, but at least the vats did not cheer when something drowned in them. That night, lying on the thin straw mat in my sleeping space above the kitchen, I could still feel the curve of the amphora against my arms. I dreamed of carrying it through endless corridors, the floor always sloping downward, the air always thick with grapes and blood. And at the end of each corridor, a pair of eyes waited for me, different every time, to drink, to smile, or to pour the wine away without touching it. I woke before dawn, my arms aching as if I'd carried the weight all night. In the weeks to come, I would learn the angles of the corridors, the rhythms of the handlers' voices, the way to tilt the jar so the wine fell in a single, unbroken ribbon. I would learn who drank deep and who merely touched the cup to their lips for luck. But that first day was different. The weight of the amphora was more than I had expected, not in pounds or stone, but in meaning. Because wine, I learned, is not poured only for thirst, it's poured for courage. I was not taken in chains. That is the first thing people get wrong when I tell them or when they imagine it for themselves. No one dragged me into the Colosseum by the wrists, no iron collar digging into my neck. I walked in of my own will, carrying nothing but a small satchel of bread, a tunic too thin for the season, and a debt that did not belong to me. It was my father's, a debt not of coin but of shame. He had been a wine merchant in the Subura district, not rich, but respected enough to keep the family fed. Until the shipment that was meant for the governor's table arrived spoiled. The barrels, once tapped, breathed sour air and bitter liquid. A feast was ruined, and in Rome, some feasts were more sacred than others. By the next week, my father's stall was empty. By the next month, he was gone. I don't know if he fled or if someone decided his absence was worth more than his apology. I only know that one morning the shop shutters were still closed at midday, and a man in a dark cloak knocked on our door instead of him. The man didn't speak my name. He spoke my mother's instead. "The family owes," he said, his voice flat, like this was a thing as ordinary as buying bread. She nodded once, as if she had expected him. I realized later she probably had. That night, she told me I would go to work for one of her brother's patrons, not in the taverns, not on the streets. "You'll be in the Colosseum," she said, as if it were a blessing. "It's honest work. You pour wine, nothing more. Nothing more." When I arrived for my first day, before they even showed me where the amphorae were stored, a man named Vibius, the handler for all drink-bearers, recited the rules. He was thin, all elbows and jaw, his tunic belted so tightly it seemed to cut him in two. His eyes had the sunken look of someone who slept little and trusted less. "There's no written oath," he told me, "but there are 3 rules. Break them and you're out if you're lucky. Rule 1, never spill." The wine was expensive, the ground already slippery enough with blood. A spill was waste, and waste was disrespect to the amphitheater, to the fighters, to the patrons who paid for the games. "If you lose a drop," he said, "you'll feel it before you see it." I didn't ask what he meant. Rule 2, never speak first. The gladiators are not your friends, they are not your audience. You wait until spoken to, and even then answer with care. "Words stick in a man's mind longer than wine," Vibius said. "Sometimes that's good. Most times it's not." Rule 3, never refuse a request. If a gladiator asks for more, you pour more. If he asks for less, you obey. If he asks for something else, a message carried, a name remembered, you don't say no. "We are here to serve," Vibius said, "and service does not ask why." He looked at me then, long enough for me to understand that the last rule was the one that mattered most, and the one most likely to destroy me. I followed those rules for months. Not perfectly, not without mistakes, but well enough to avoid Vibius's stare. My hands learned the weight of the amphora, the tilt of the pour, the way to keep my fingers steady when the man in front of me was shaking with rage or fear. 3 months after my first pour, I could tell by the way a gladiator held his cup whether he wanted to drink or simply feel the weight of it. I could tell which ones preferred the rim wet before the wine touched it, which ones liked the stream high and fast, and which ones wanted it slow, so they could watch the liquid spiral into the bottom. What I didn't expect was how often the job felt like listening to a confession. A man with a scar running from ear to jaw once told me, without preamble, that he dreamed every night of the man he'd killed last season. He didn't ask for advice. He just wanted the words to land somewhere before he went out to kill again. Another, his shoulder wrapped in a strip of cloth still wet from the surgeon's bucket, whispered the name of a woman. He didn't tell me who she was: wife, sister, lover, only that I should say it once to myself before he entered the sand. "So she's in the air with me," he said. I poured. I nodded. I did not speak first. The hardest were the quiet ones. The men who didn't look at you, didn't speak, didn't even lift their heads when you approached. They would take the cup, drink, and hand it back without a sound. Their silence pressed on me more heavily than any story. It was as if the wine wasn't meant to touch their lips at all, but some part of themselves they were already leaving behind. I told myself the rules kept me safe. As long as I obeyed them, the work was simple: hold the amphora steady, keep my eyes lowered, step away when the cup is empty. But rules are also boundaries, and boundaries are where the worst things happen. A man can only follow them for so long before he is asked to step past them, not by force, but by something softer. By trust, by desperation, by the kind of request that doesn't sound like a request at all. It happened the first time in the late summer games, when the air in the corridors felt like steam and the amphora sweated in my arms. I poured for a man named Cashin, younger than most, broad-shouldered, his hair tied back with a strip of faded cloth. I'd seen him fight once before and win. That day he barely looked at me when I filled his cup, but when he handed it back, he pressed something against my palm with the heel of his hand. It was small and hard, wrapped in thin leather. "Keep it," he murmured, "until after." And then he walked away. I didn't open it, not then, not until the matches were over and the corridors emptied. Inside the leather was a single wax tablet, no bigger than my hand, with shallow marks pressed into it. The letters were hurried, slanted, barely legible. I read them twice before they made sense, and when they did, my fingers went cold. I never told Vibius about the tablet. I never told anyone. But it was the first time I realized that my hands could carry more than wine. They could carry something that might decide whether a man lived or died. That was when the rules began to feel less like safety and more like a noose. Weeks later, I returned the tablet to Cashin as he stood in the preparation chamber before another fight. He didn't ask if I'd read it. He didn't have to. He only nodded once, the faintest ghost of a smile on his face, and then he drank. The fight lasted less than 5 minutes. I watched from the shadows of the service tunnel as he went down beneath another man's blade, his blood spreading into the sand like ink in water. Afterward, when I poured for the next group, my hands were steady. Too steady. That night, lying on my mat, I went over the 3 rules in my head like a prayer: never spill, never speak first, never refuse a request. I had followed them all, and still, Cashin was dead. It was then I began to suspect that rules are not made to protect you. They are made to tell you exactly where you will stand when the blade comes. I thought rules kept you safe, but they only tell you how you'll die. Morning in the Colosseum was nothing like the afternoons the crowds remember. There was no roar yet. No chants, no trumpets, no wave of noise rolling through the stands. Just the creak of wooden gates being checked, the soft rasp of whetstones against metal, the faint slosh of water being poured into troughs. It was the hour when shadows still clung to the corners of the preparation chambers, when the air was cool enough that a man's breath showed for a few moments before fading. I liked that hour not because it was peaceful, but because it was honest. There was no pretending in the mornings, not from the gladiators, not from the handlers, not even from us cup-bearers. Everyone knew what was coming, and no one had yet found the mask they would wear before stepping into the light. I learned quickly that the mornings were for 3 things: eating, moving, and sharpening. The food was plain, barley porridge thickened with goat's milk, bread still warm from the oven, sometimes olives if the day's games were important. Gladiators were not fed for pleasure, they were fed for endurance. I had been told once by an old trainer that a good fighter's belly was like a shield, full and firm enough to take a blow without folding. After eating, they moved. Not the frantic, lunging practice I expected, but slow, deliberate stretches. Some rolled their shoulders until they cracked, others crouched low, swaying like wrestlers waiting for a signal. The air filled with the quiet percussion of bodies being readied, the pop of joints, the thud of palms hitting bare skin, the measured exhale of controlled breathing. And then came the sharpening. That sound never left you. A slow scrape, metal against stone, repeated until it became a rhythm, a heartbeat that wasn't yours. I would arrive with the amphora just as the first blades were being tested on scraps of leather. The wine was not for this hour. My job then was simply to be seen, to remind them that when the time came, the cups would be ready. Some men glanced at me and nodded. Others ignored me completely. A few, the newer ones, would watch me as if trying to measure how much wine they would be allowed, as though the size of the cup could change the day's outcome. What struck me most was the quiet. Even with the scraping of steel and the low murmur of the handlers, the chambers felt like a church before a funeral. That same sense of waiting, of breath held. Except here, everyone knew whose funeral it would be, and that the man might still be standing beside them. In that hour, the bravado was gone. No grins, no shouts, no pounding of shields, just men checking their gear, checking their hands, checking themselves. I began to think of mornings as the most dangerous time, not because of the weapons, but because of what they made you feel. The calm was heavy. It settled on your shoulders and pressed into your bones until you believed that maybe nothing would happen today after all. But something always happened. The corridors smelled different in the morning. The metallic tang was there, faint and waiting, but it was overlaid with the scent of oiled leather, wood shavings from repaired weapon handles, and the earthy sweetness of barley steam drifting from the kitchens. The smell of living men, not yet the smell of the dead. I used to breathe deeper in those hours, as if storing it, because by the afternoon it would be gone. The handlers were the only ones who seemed immune to the quiet. They moved with the precision of men who had done the same work for years, checking straps, tightening buckles, adjusting greaves, barking orders when a man moved too slowly. They knew the schedule down to the heartbeat, when to call for water, when to call for wine, when to start sending men up the ramp toward the gate. And they knew when to stop talking altogether. That moment was always the same, when the sunlight from the arena slit began to shift across the floor, creeping toward the feet of the first man in line. Once, during my 3rd month, I lingered longer than I should have in the morning hour. I had poured for no one yet, but I stayed near the wall, my amphora braced against my hip, watching a man named Gaius. He was sharpening his sword, not hurriedly, not lazily, but with the kind of patience that makes the world slow down around it. "Why do you do it so long?" I asked before remembering the second rule, never speak first. He looked up, not angry, just measuring. "So it knows me," he said, turning the blade in the light. "Steel listens, boy, you teach it your rhythm, it stays true." He went back to sharpening. I didn't ask again. Outside, above our heads, the crowd was beginning to gather. I could hear it in the shifting air, a low hum, the occasional laugh, the distant bark of vendors selling bread and olives. The Colosseum was waking up. That was when the handlers would call for the first cups. Not for thirst, no man was thirsty before stepping onto the sand, but for courage. A swallow to wet the tongue, to remind the body of pleasure before asking it to endure pain. I would start at one end of the chamber, the amphora heavy but balanced now in my hands, and move between the men. Most took only a mouthful. A few drained the cup and held it out again, not with a plea but with a challenge. One man spat the wine onto the ground, muttering that it was too sweet, that he wanted his mouth to taste only of metal. In those moments, the quiet began to fracture. Voices rose, jokes were told. Helmets were lifted onto heads. The scrape of steel became the clang of blades tested against shields. The air grew warmer, thicker, charged with something close to joy and nothing like peace. It was then I learned the mornings were not a kindness. They were a test. The Colosseum gave you that stillness so you could feel it break, and when it broke, it was like glass, sharp, sudden, leaving you blinking at the brightness pouring in. The last thing before the gates opened was always the same, the signal from above. A horn, low and long, echoing through the stone like a wave rolling toward shore. Men would lift their heads toward the sound, some closed their eyes, some gripped their weapons harder, one or two would laugh, a short, hard sound, as if they'd just remembered a joke no one else would hear. The handlers lined them up. The ramp to the arena yawned ahead, sunlight spilling down it in a pale column. Dust floated in that light, rising and falling with the movement of the air. I would stand back then, my amphora empty or nearly so, and watch the first man step forward. The quiet collapsed in on itself. The hum of the crowd surged. The sound of sandals on stone grew sharper, faster. And then the gates began to lift. But once the gates opened, there was no more morning, only heat and the smell of death ripening. I first noticed him because he didn't notice me. Most men at least glanced when the amphora came close, some with thirst in their eyes, some with the half grin of men who thought themselves untouchable, some with fear they tried to hide, but he never looked up. Not once. He sat near the wall in the preparation chamber, his back against the stone, his elbows resting loosely on his knees. When I approached, he would lift the cup without raising his eyes, and when I poured, he would nod once in thanks. No words, no questions, just the sound of the wine filling the clay, the faint hiss of liquid against the cup's inner glaze. In the first weeks, I thought it was arrogance, that he believed himself above speaking to a cup-bearer. But over time, I saw it for what it was, a kind of discipline, so tight it could not be broken by something as small as conversation. He was older than most. Not old by Rome's measure, perhaps 30, but older than the boys barely grown into their muscle, older than the veterans who had lost too much blood to keep their youth. His hair was cropped close, his beard trimmed short, as if every detail of his appearance was chosen to keep the world from catching on him. His body bore the history his mouth would not speak. I learned to read those marks. There was the narrow pale seam along his left bicep, a clean slice that could only have come from a gladius angled upward. There was the jagged tear across his ribs, deeper in the middle, where the point of a spear had bitten before sliding away. His right thigh carried a flat, wide scar, the sort left by fire, not blade. In the arena, scars were more than wounds healed over. They were records, proof of survival. A man with a single scar might be lucky. A man with many was dangerous, not because he could not be killed, but because he knew how not to be. I didn't know his name for months. No one spoke it in my hearing. The handlers called him the Thracian once, but it was said in the offhand way you speak of a man's birthplace, not his identity. What I did know was this: he always drank exactly 2 swallows. No more, no less. Even on the hottest days, even when the air in the chambers felt thick enough to drink without a cup, he would take his 2 measured mouthfuls, hand the cup back, and return to whatever thought lived behind his eyes. I found myself waiting for him in the line, adjusting my path so I would pour for him last, as if saving a quiet for the end of my circuit. There was something in the way he held the cup, not with greed or need, but with steadiness that made my own hands steadier. In those silent exchanges, I imagined I could read his breathing. He inhaled deeply before the first swallow, held it for a beat, and exhaled through the second. It felt ritualistic, though I never asked. The second rule still bound my tongue: never speak first. There was one morning, late in the spring games, when I broke that rule. I was pouring for him, watching the light slide over the curve of the amphora when I said, too softly for the handlers to hear, "Why only 2? He looked at me then. Not up, not straight, but sideways, his eyes narrowing as if adjusting to a light he hadn't expected. He didn't answer, just took his first swallow, breathed out, took the second, and handed the cup back. I felt foolish. but from then on he would look at me just for a moment before drinking. The closest I came to hearing his voice was not in words but in sound. One afternoon, after a match I didn't see, he came into the preparation chamber with his left arm bound in fresh linen. The skin beneath it was swollen, the bandage dark with seeped blood. I poured for him, expecting him to nod as always. Instead, as he lifted the cup, he exhaled through his teeth, a sharp hiss, not of anger but of pain. The sound stayed with me longer than any name could have. I began to notice that the other men kept a certain distance from him. Not out of fear, there was no mocking, no challenge, but as though he carried his own weather, and stepping into it without reason would be impolite. Some gladiators laughed loudly before their matches, slapping each other's shoulders, boasting about how quickly they'd win. He stayed apart, polishing his blade, checking the leather on his greaves, measuring the width of the straps on his shield. If any man was prepared to live through the day, it was him, and yet the arena makes liars of all appearances. One morning, after I had grown used to his place in the line, the way his silence felt like a stone in the river, unmoved by the current, he did not come. His place against the wall was empty. The handlers moved the others along without comment, but I found myself glancing toward the entrance again and again, expecting him to appear. He didn't. Later, in the heat of the afternoon, I asked one of the other cup-bearers where the Thracian had gone. He shrugged. In the cells, fighting later. When later came, I waited by the tunnel, but the man who stepped out into the light was not him. It was someone younger, with no scars worth reading, no steady rhythm to his breath. I told myself the Thracian would fight tomorrow or the next day. Days passed. He did not return to the preparation chamber. Then, one morning, he was there again, but different. His left leg was bound from knee to ankle, the cloth stained and stiff. He leaned heavily on his shield, his weight tilted to one side. His eyes met mine as I approached, and for the first time I saw something in them I had never seen before: urgency. He took the cup, drank both swallows without pause, and held it out again. I hesitated. He had never taken more. But the third rule pressed against my thoughts: never refuse a request. I poured. He drained it, set the cup down beside him, and looked at me in a way that felt almost like a farewell. I didn't see him fight that day. I didn't need to. The next morning, his place by the wall was empty again, and this time no one said later. When I asked Vibius, he only shook his head. "Don't grow attached," he said. "Silence dies the same as noise." But silence doesn't die, it lingers. It waits in the space after the last word, in the pause between the pour and the sip. I thought I understood him, until I poured for him on the day he didn't come back. The Cena Libera was Rome's favorite lie. They called it a feast, a generous gift from the editor of the games, offered to the gladiators the night before they fought. It was meant to show the crowd that the fighters were treated well, fed well, honored before their moment in the sand, but we all knew the truth. The feast was not kindness, it was a stage. The people came to watch them eat like they would watch them bleed, for the same reason, to see men live as though they were not about to die. The tables were set in the forum, long wooden boards propped on trestles, the seats arranged so the public could stroll between them. Torches flared in iron baskets, their smoke curling into the night air. Musicians played somewhere near the back, the sound of reed pipes drifting over the clatter of dishes and the hum of the crowd. The gladiators sat in their finest tunics, freshly bathed, their hair oiled and combed. It was the cleanest they would be for weeks, and the crowd adored them like that, dressed not as killers but as men worth killing. I walked among them with my amphora, the Falernian wine sloshing against its sides. The air was thick with smells: roasted pork glazed in honey, warm bread still dusted with flour, garum sauce sharp enough to sting the nose, bowls of figs and dates laid out like jewels. I knew the feast was meant for show, but I couldn't help watching the way they ate. Some tore into the food as if they'd been starving for weeks, grease running down their hands, bread crumbs clinging to their chins. Others ate slowly, savoring every bite, chewing with care as if each mouthful might be their last, which, for some, it would be. I learned to read them by how they drank. The boastful ones emptied their cups in a single swallow, calling for more before I'd even set the amphora down. They wanted the crowd to see their bravado, their fearlessness, their hunger for the next day's fight. The quieter ones held the wine to their lips without drinking, letting it rest there like a kiss they weren't ready to take. And some poured a drop on the ground before sipping, a small offering to the gods or to someone they had lost. There was no rule for me here, no second rule about speaking first, no handlers to bark orders over my shoulder. The feast was as close to freedom as I ever came in my work. I could linger, I could listen, I could even smile when a joke was told in my direction. But freedom is only a different kind of performance. The men would lean toward me as I poured, their voices low so the crowd wouldn't hear. They told me who they wanted to see in the stands tomorrow. They told me what to do with their share of the prize if they survived. They told me more than once who to send word to if they didn't. And all the while, the crowd drifted between the tables, laughing and pointing as if they were at a market, inspecting the goods before purchase. The propaganda was perfect. The feast made it look as if the fighters were honored guests at their own execution. The citizens could go home that night believing the men had eaten well, drunk the best wine, been cheered by the people. It was easier that way to see them as willing, even fortunate, participants in the games. I suppose it worked on some of the fighters too. For a few hours, with the wine warming their throats and the torches turning the air gold, they could almost forget what awaited them. As I moved down the row, I found myself stopping at a table where 4 men sat close together, their plates still nearly full. They were talking quietly, their heads bent toward one another. One of them, a tall man with cropped hair and a scar over his right eyebrow, glanced up as I approached and held out his cup. His name was Lucius. I'd poured for him before in the mornings before a match, and he had always been polite, almost formal in his nods of thanks. But tonight his eyes didn't leave mine as I tipped the amphora. When the cup was full, he didn't drink. He set it down beside his plate, leaned back, and asked, "Do you trust me?" I froze, my hands still wrapped around the neck of the amphora. No one had ever asked me that before. He smiled faintly, as if he knew the question was impossible to answer. "Good," he said. "Then you won't ask what it is." The other men kept talking, not looking at us. Lucius reached under the table and pressed something into my free hand. It was small, wrapped in a scrap of linen, warm from his palm. "Keep it until tomorrow," he said. "You'll know when." Before I could speak, he lifted his cup and drank, draining it in 3 long swallows. I poured again without being asked, the third rule already echoing in my head, and then I moved on. I didn't open the bundle. Not then. The amphora was heavy in my arms, the smell of roasted pork and wine filling my nose, the music weaving in and out of the night air. My work kept me moving, and soon the crowd's laughter swallowed the moment whole. But the weight of that scrap of linen was different from the weight of the amphora. I could feel it in my pocket as I leaned to pour for the next man, as I stepped over a stray bone on the ground, as I smiled at a woman in the crowd who told me I had the hands of a poet. I kept wondering what Lucius had meant, "You'll know when." As the night wore on, the feast began to change. The plates emptied. The wine took hold. The men who had eaten in silence began to talk, their voices louder now, their gestures looser. Boasts filled the air, promises of quick kills, of spectacular tricks in the arena, of opponents who would fall after a single strike. The crowd loved it. They clapped, they cheered, they leaned in to hear more. The feast had done its work. It had turned men into characters, their fates already rehearsed in the minds of those watching. But I couldn't stop glancing down the table toward Lucius. He didn't join in the boasting. He sat with one hand on his cup, his eyes moving slowly over the crowd as if memorizing faces. When the feast finally ended, the crowd drifted away toward the taverns, still laughing, still speaking of the games to come. The gladiators were led back toward the holding cells, their steps slower now, their stomachs full, the wine heavy in their blood. I walked with the other cup-bearers toward the storeroom, my amphora nearly empty, but the linen-wrapped weight in my pocket felt heavier than the jar. That night, lying on my mat, I didn't sleep. I kept turning the bundle over in my fingers, wondering if I should open it. But something, maybe his tone, maybe the look in his eyes, kept me from it. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself it was just some trinket, a token to bring luck tomorrow, but deep down I knew it was something else, something I would carry into the morning. That night, one of them asked for a favor I should never have agreed to. By morning, the linen-wrapped bundle felt heavier than it had the night before, though I knew its weight hadn't changed. The heaviness was in me now, the awareness that I carried something meant to be carried, not questioned. The Sina Libera had left the fighters sluggish in their steps, but the handlers were sharper than usual, barking orders, making sure the day began without delay. The games would start sooner than most. A visiting dignitary wanted to see the opening match before midday. I was in the storeroom when Lucius appeared in the doorway. He wore the same expression he'd had at the feast, focused, searching, but his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "Walk with me," he said. We moved through the service corridors, the air cool and damp, the stones sweating in the early light. He led me to a small side chamber I had never noticed before, barely larger than a storage niche. Inside, a single amphora sat on the floor, its clay darkened with age, the pitch seal at its mouth unbroken. "This one," he said, tapping the neck. "It needs to go to a man outside the arena. You'll see him when the crowd comes in red cloak, standing near the east gate. He'll have a scar on his lip. Hand it to him yourself." I looked at the amphora. It was lighter than a full jar should have been, and the seal wasn't marked with any of the painted symbols that told the handlers what wine it held. "What's in it?" I asked before I could stop myself. He gave me a look that was almost a smile, but without warmth. "You don't want to know." I could have refused. The third rule, never refuse a request, wasn't a law carved in stone. Vibius had told me once, in his dry way, that there were requests a smart man learned to avoid, but Lucius's eyes were steady on mine, and I found myself nodding. He crouched to lift the amphora, grunting slightly as he set it in my arms. The clay was cool, the weight shifting oddly as if whatever was inside didn't move like liquid. "Don't drop it," he said, though his tone was not teasing, "and don't open it." I carried it back through the corridors, my grip tighter than it needed to be. The amphora wasn't heavy enough to strain my arms, but my muscles ached anyway. It wasn't just wine now, it was something else entirely, and that something seemed to pull my thoughts toward it. In the preparation chamber, I set it in the corner near my usual station, half hidden behind a stack of sealed jars. I poured from another amphora for the first wave of fighters, but my eyes kept flicking back to that unmarked clay. Smuggling was not uncommon in the Colosseum. Fighters sometimes found ways to get small trinkets, charms, or even bits of food into their cells, a touch of the outside world before the sand swallowed them. Messages were harder, too many hands and eyes between sender and receiver. The safest way to move anything past the gates was in plain sight. An amphora was perfect. To the untrained eye, they all looked alike, same curve, same clay, same pitch seal, and no one would question a cup-bearer carrying one. Still, the thought of it unsettled me. Wine was simple. It had a weight, a temperature, a scent you could trust. You knew when it was pure and when it was spoiled. But this was something I could not name, could not guess, and that ignorance made it heavier than lead. Lucius caught my eye as he passed toward the ramp. He didn't speak, didn't gesture, but his glance was enough to remind me of the red cloak, the scarred lip. When the crowd began to file in, I slipped from the chamber, the unmarked amphora cradled in my arms. The sun outside was bright, the light cutting sharp edges into the marble and stone. I kept to the shaded edge of the walkway, scanning the faces near the east gate. It took only moments to spot him, the red cloak draped over his shoulders, the thin white scar cutting across his upper lip. He stood apart from the others, not watching the fighters or the crowd, but scanning the entrances like a man waiting for a signal. I was halfway to him when I heard my name. Vibius's voice was sharp, too close behind me. "Where are you going with that?" I froze. The amphora seemed suddenly fragile in my arms, the seal at its neck catching the sunlight like a warning. "It's for one of the handlers," I said, my mouth dry. Vibius's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, his shadow falling across the jar. "Since when do you carry unmarked stock to the gates? Who told you to?" I opened my mouth, closed it again. Lying to Vibius was like drinking seawater. It could keep you alive for a moment, but it would kill you faster in the end. Before I could answer, the call came from the preparation chamber. The first fighters were ready. Vibius glanced back toward the sound, then fixed me with a look I didn't fully understand, not suspicion, but something colder. "Put it back," he said. Now, I turned, carrying the amphora back through the corridor. My heart was loud in my ears, my steps quicker than they should have been for the weight I held. When I reached the chamber, I didn't return it to its corner. I set it beside me, the clay touching my leg as I poured from the other jars. The coolness of it seeped into my skin, a steady reminder of what I was and wasn't doing. Lucius passed me once more before stepping onto the ramp. His eyes flicked to the jar, then to my face. There was no anger there, no surprise, only a long, unreadable silence. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then walked on without a word. The amphora stayed beside me for the rest of the morning, its seal unbroken. I told myself I was protecting it, keeping it safe until there was another chance to pass it on. But deep down, I knew the truth. It was safer here than in the hands of the man in the red cloak, and I was safer not knowing why. Still, every time I glanced at it, I imagined the contents: a weapon, a letter, a bribe. Or something else entirely, something I couldn't yet name but would come to wish I had never touched. I had carried many amphorae before, heavier, larger, filled to the brim. But this was the first that seemed to carry me. It followed me in thought, in the way my fingers curled even when empty, in the faint throb in my forearms hours after setting it down. But the jar never left my hands, and because of that, I saw what I was never meant to see. The day began like any other, but the air had a weight to it I couldn't name. Even before the sun rose high enough to touch the top tiers of the Colosseum, the crowd's murmur felt different, not a restless hum, but a taut, expectant thread stretched over the entire arena. Vibius said nothing as we moved through the corridors, but I saw it in the handlers' faces. There was talk of a special match, though no one would say what made it special. By the time I reached the preparation chamber, Lucius was already there. He sat on the low bench, his elbows resting on his knees, head bowed. The amphora, the unmarked one, was still at my side. He didn't look at it. He didn't look at me. When I poured his cup, he took it with both hands and drank, the line of his throat shifting with each swallow. 3 swallows, more than he had ever taken before. He handed the cup back and stood, his shadow stretching long in the narrow light from the arena slit. For the first time, I thought he looked tired, not worn from battle, but tired in the way a man does when he's already decided how the day will end. The horn sounded earlier than usual, its low notes sinking into the stone. The handlers moved quickly, checking straps and buckles, pressing helmets into hands, thrusting shields toward waiting arms. The air in the chamber thickened with the smell of oiled leather and steel. I stayed at my post, the amphora balanced against my hip, watching as Lucius moved toward the ramp. He didn't glance back. When the gates opened, the light was blinding. I stepped into the service tunnel behind the handlers, just far enough to see the arena floor. The sand was pale in the morning sun, still clean from the night's sweep. The roar of the crowd rolled down like a wave breaking on stone, heat and noise pressing into the bones. Two lines of fighters emerged from opposite ends of the arena. Lucius was among them, his shield lifted, his gladius low at his side. I scanned the other line but saw no familiar faces, only men built for killing, their eyes hard, their weapons gleaming. The first clash was fast and loud, steel on steel, the thud of shields colliding, the grunt of exertion. The crowd roared approval, the noise cresting with each blow. The fighters circled, broke, and collided again. Lucius moved like water, slipping past strikes, his blade darting in quick, controlled bursts. He cut a man across the thigh, kicked another hard enough to send him sprawling. For a moment I believed he might see the end of the fight standing. But belief is a fragile thing in the arena. It happened in a blink. A fighter from the far right, one I hadn't noticed, surged toward him, a curved blade flashing in the sun. Lucius turned in time to block, but the impact jarred his shield arm, leaving his side open. The man's second strike came low, punching into his abdomen with sickening precision. The crowd roared. Lucius staggered, his hand going to the wound. Dark blood spilled between his fingers, pattering onto the sand. I don't remember dropping the amphora, but I heard the sound, the dull thud as it hit the stone beside me, the faint slosh of wine inside. I stepped forward before I realized I was moving, my eyes fixed on him. He backed away from his opponent, his shield lowered now, his breathing ragged. The sand beneath him was already changing color, pale turning to rusty brown. The crowd had gone from cheering to chanting, their voices pounding like drums. He tried to lift his blade, but the other man was already on him. The final strike drove into his chest, deep enough that I could see the jolt in his shoulders as it landed. Lucius fell backward, his head hitting the sand with a soft, almost gentle sound. His shield rolled from his grip, spinning once before lying still. The crowd's roar swelled again, not in grief, but in hunger satisfied. Something broke in me then. I stepped onto the sand, I don't know why. Perhaps I thought I could reach him, that the handlers would allow it if they saw my purpose. Perhaps I didn't think at all. I knelt beside him, my knees sinking into the warm grit. His eyes were open, the same steady eyes that had measured me the night before. His lips moved, but no sound came. Without thinking, I reached for the amphora I had dropped. My hands shook as I uncorked it, the pitch giving way with a brittle crack. I poured a thin stream into the cup, lifted it to his lips. He drank not much, just enough to wet his mouth. Some of it spilled down his chin, staining the sand. It was the first time I tasted wine meant for another. I don't know why I did it, maybe to know what his last taste was. It was warm, darker than Falernian, with a bitter edge that lingered. The handlers reached us then, pushing me back, pulling him by the shoulders toward the edge of the arena. I stood where I was, the cup still in my hand, the taste of the wine still on my tongue. The sand beneath where he had lain was no longer brown. It was black, soaked through until it looked like a hole in the earth. The rest of the fight blurred, bodies moving, blades flashing, the crowd's roar rising and falling like a tide I no longer cared to follow. My eyes stayed on that blackened patch as if it might swallow the rest of the arena whole. When the match ended, the victors lifted their weapons to the stands, blood dripping from steel. The crowd cheered as if the morning had delivered them a gift. I walked back to the service tunnel alone. The amphora felt heavier than it had in my arms, though it was half empty now. In the storeroom, I set it down with more care than it deserved. My hands were stained, not just with wine, but with the tacky residue of blood. I didn't wash them right away. I sat on the cool stone floor, my back against the wall, and stared at my fingers. Somewhere above, the next match had already begun. The crowd cheered, steel clashed, life went on, but for me, something had ended there in the sand. Lucius's bundle was still in my sleeping space that night. I didn't touch it, not yet. The taste of the wine was still in my mouth, and I wasn't ready to know if the two were connected. I lay awake for hours, hearing the crowds chant in my head, seeing the way the sand had turned black beneath him. After that day, the wine tasted different, like it had learned the name of death. After Lucius died, I was sent below. No explanation, no accusation, just Vibius telling me in that dry voice of his, "You'll work the cellar now." He didn't need to say what everyone knew. The handlers preferred not to see the faces of men who'd broken the rhythm. And stepping onto the sand, even for a breath, even without a weapon, was breaking it. The hypogeum was a world beneath a world. The air was damp and cool, heavy with the smell of wet stone. Light came in thin slices from high grates, dust motes drifting in the beams like tiny, aimless ghosts. It was not only wine that was stored here. The amphorae were stacked in rows along the walls, their painted symbols fading in the gloom. Between them stood crates of equipment, helmets with dented crowns, shields split at the rim, leather straps stiff with old sweat. And farther back, beyond the reach of most visitors, were the cells for the animals waiting to be loosed into the arena. The lions were the worst. You could smell them before you heard them, a hot, sour musk that clung to your skin. Their growls traveled through the stone like a slow-moving quake, rattling in your ribs. And then there were the other rooms, the ones not spoken of. They didn't call them morgues. No one in Rome liked the idea of storing the dead as if they were goods. But that's what they were, low, cool spaces where the bodies of the fallen were kept until they could be dragged out the service gates. Some days, the bodies came in faster than the wine. The first time I walked past that room, I caught the smell before I saw the door, a thick, sweet rot that tangled with the scent of cork and pitch. It struck me that the two were not so different. Wine was just a fruit that had been allowed to rot politely. My duties were simple. I was to keep track of the wine and keep it moving. No pouring, no serving. Just lifting jars, logging their markings, and making sure the handlers above had what they needed. It should have felt like a reprieve. No crowds, no blood, no eyes on me. But the quiet below was a different kind of weight. Every sound echoed, the scrape of clay against stone, the slow drip of water from the ceiling, the shuffle of something alive in the dark corners. Days blurred. I would rise in darkness, descend into darkness, and leave only when the oil lamps burned low. I began to lose the sense of when the games were above me, except for the faint tremors in the stone when the crowd roared. The noise reached us like a memory, muffled and distorted, as though the cheering was for something that had already happened. It was in this place, 3 weeks after Lucius's death, that I found the jar again. I had been shifting a stack of amphorae near the far wall, my hands numbed from the cold of the clay. One jar, tucked behind the others, had no painted symbol. No vine, no laurel, no bird. The pitch at its mouth was the same dark seal I remembered. My stomach tightened before I even touched it. I knelt and ran my hands over the surface. The clay was cool, almost damp, as if it had sweated in the dark. I didn't need to lift it to know what it was, or at least what I believed it to be. Lucius's amphora, the one I had never delivered. The one I had opened, just enough to pour his last drink. I should have left it there. Left it to gather dust and damp in the corner until someone else moved it, not knowing. But my fingers curled around its neck and I pulled it free. I told myself I was only moving it to a safer place, away from the bustle of the handlers who came down for supplies. But the truth was, I couldn't bear to let it sit there forgotten. I set it against the wall by my own station, where the lamplight just reached it. And from that moment on, I found myself glancing at it more often than I realized, as if it were watching me as much as I was watching it. The cellar had its own rhythms. The steady roll of barrels, the scrape of clay on stone, the soft thump of bodies, animal or human, being moved down the hall. At first, I tried to lose myself in that rhythm, to let it erase the memory of sand turning black, but the jar broke that rhythm. Its silence was different from the others. It was not the silence of emptiness, but of holding. I began to think about what might be inside more than I thought about anything else. A message, a bribe, something meant to save a life or end one. I wondered if the man in the red cloak still waited somewhere in the city, unaware that the thing he was meant to receive sat in the shadows, unclaimed. The thought made me uneasy, not because of what I had done, but because of what might happen if someone else opened it. The days below were cold, but I began to sweat whenever my hand brushed against the amphora. I imagined the pitch seal softening under my touch, imagined it giving way, imagined the smell of whatever lay inside curling up into the dim air. I told myself I wouldn't open it. I told myself I didn't need to know. But each time I repeated the words, they sounded less like truth and more like a dare. And in that darkness, I found the jar again. I lasted 4 days before I broke the seal. 4 days of moving amphorae in the dim light, 4 days of pretending not to glance at the one without a painted mark. 4 days of telling myself it wasn't my place to know and feeling my fingers twitch every time I passed it. It was late when I finally gave in. The others had gone above to eat, their voices fading along the corridor. I stayed behind, oil lamp flickering on the low table, the shadows shivering along the walls. I pulled the jar close. The clay was colder than I remembered, as if it had been steeped in the stone itself. My thumb traced the rough edge of the pitch seal. I had opened hundreds of amphorae before, Falernian, Kekuban, cheap sour vintages for the handlers, but the sound was always the same, a dry crack, a faint resinous smell from the pitch. This one felt heavier, as though the seal held back something more than air. When it gave, the sound seemed too loud in the stillness. The pitch broke in a jagged ring, pieces scattering onto the table. I tilted the jar, expecting at least a splash of liquid. Nothing. A dry, muffled thud came from inside. I peered into the darkness of the neck, but saw only shadow. I reached in, my fingers brushing against fabric, stiff, rough, and damp in places that should have been dry. When I pulled it free, the cloth unfurled onto the table with a weight that made my stomach tighten. It was a strip of linen, the length of my forearm, stained deep brown in irregular patches. The smell rose immediately, iron and earth, faint but unmistakable. Old blood. The edges of the cloth were frayed, but down the center ran a line of tiny stitches in dark thread. Not random mending letters. Words, carefully sewn in a hand small enough to hide its meaning from anyone not looking for it. I bent close, the lamp's flame wavering over the fabric. The Romans had many ways to send messages. Wax tablets for the bold, ink on papyrus for the practical, codes scratched into walls for those in the shadows. But textiles were for the desperate. A strip of cloth could be worn as a bandage, tied into clothing, or wrapped around a wrist. It could pass unnoticed through the busiest gates. And stitches could carry words that only someone who knew the pattern could read. I read the message once, then again. The words were simple enough in Latin, but the meaning was heavier than the amphora had ever been. A name, a place. And 2 words that could have been an order or a plea. The name was not Luxius's. It was someone I didn't know, someone who, if the message reached the wrong ears, would not live long enough for me to learn who they were. I sat back, the cloth spread before me, the lamp guttering low. My hands felt unclean, though I'd touched no blood but what was dried into the weave. The amphora had been his coffin for this message, and I had been its gravekeeper without knowing. If I returned it to the shadows, it would be safe for a while. Safe from the wrong hands, safe from my own. But safe, too, from whoever was meant to receive it. A noise in the corridor made me fold the cloth quickly, tucking it into my tunic. My heart pounded as footsteps passed the storeroom without stopping. The jar still sat open on the table, empty now except for the smell that clung to it. I should have sealed it again. I should have hidden it. Instead, I left it there, bare-mouthed, as if daring someone to notice. When the others returned, I busied myself with shifting other jars. No one asked why one sat open on the table. Maybe they didn't care, maybe they already knew better than to ask. The cloth burned against my chest all night. I didn't dream. Or if I did, I dreamed in thread and blood, the stitches pulling tight until they cut into my skin. By morning, I knew two things. One, I couldn't give the cloth to the man in the red cloak now, if he was even still waiting. Two, carrying it made me part of something I didn't understand, and in Rome, ignorance was not protection. I went about my work as if nothing had changed, but my hands were different now. Every amphora I lifted felt like it might hide another secret, and every set of footsteps in the corridor sounded like someone coming to claim the one I had stolen. And when I poured again, days later, for the first time since being sent below, I felt it in my grip, the weight of the cloth, the thread biting through my palm. And I realized, the next cup I poured might be my own. The day I left the arena began like every other, oil lamps guttering in the low corridors, the damp smell of stone, the amphorae lined against the walls like sentries. But I woke with a thought I could not shake. I would not end the day here. I didn't know yet where I would go, only that I could not keep carrying wine as if it were only wine. Not after Lucius, not after the jar, not with the cloth sewn in blood hidden in the folds of my tunic. Above, the games had already begun. I could feel the faint tremor of the crowds roar through the flagstones beneath my feet. Vibius had given me no instructions that morning, perhaps by accident, perhaps because he no longer expected me to need them. I carried the amphora up from the cellar anyway, out of habit more than duty. When I stepped into the preparation chamber, the air was warm with the smell of sweat and leather. Fighters waited in the half-light, some adjusting straps, others staring into nothing. I moved among them for what I knew would be the last time. The first man I poured for barely looked at me. His cup tilted, the wine spilling into a clean ribbon. I steadied my hand, but my thoughts were elsewhere, on the final pour I knew was coming. When I reached the end of the line, there was no one else to serve. No Lucius against the wall, no silent nod from the Thracian. Only the weight of the amphora in my arms, heavier now with what I had decided. I set the amphora on the bench, took a cup from the rack, and filled it to the brim. The wine caught the light from the narrow window, deep red with that faint gold sheen Falernian was famous for. I lifted it, not to another man, but to my own lips. It was the first time I had ever poured for myself. The taste was everything and nothing, sweet, yes, but edged with bitterness. Warm from the clay, but carrying the memory of cool cellars and darker rooms. I swallowed slowly, as if each mouthful might undo the years I had spent giving the best wine in Rome to men who would never taste it twice. By the third swallow, I felt the heat spread through my chest, a false comfort. I thought of all the mouths I had poured for, mouths that shouted, cursed, prayed, mouths that smiled and mouths that died still wet. I drained the cup, set it down, and poured the rest of the amphora out onto the stone floor. The wine spread in a dark pool, seeping into the cracks like it was looking for a way out. There are punishments in Rome for desertion, for theft, for betrayal. A cup-bearer who walked away without permission could be beaten, branded, or worse. But the moment I stepped toward the exit, I understood something the rules had never taught me. I was already marked. Not on my skin, but in my memory. The outer corridor smelled different from the chambers, cleaner, the air moving freely from the gates. I walked without hurry, the folded strip of blood-stained cloth pressing against my ribs with each step. I didn't know if I would ever deliver it to its intended hands. I didn't even know if those hands were still alive, but I knew it would not rot in the dark again. At the service gate, a guard glanced at me but said nothing. I carried no amphora now, no tools of my trade, just a small satchel with a crust of bread, a flask of water, and the cloth. The sun hit me like a hammer when I stepped outside. The noise of the crowd became distant, a hollow thunder behind me. I turned once, looking back at the walls of the Colosseum. From out here, you could almost believe it was just a building. Almost, but I knew better. I walked until the sound of the crowd was gone, until the smell of blood and cork was replaced by the baking dust of the streets. Every step felt both heavier and lighter, as if I were leaving something behind and carrying it at the same time. I didn't know then where I would sleep that night, but I knew one thing with certainty: I would never pour wine again, not for gladiators, not for patrons. Not for anyone, because wine was not just drink to me now. It was the last taste before the end, and I could not give that to another man again without feeling the weight of those I had already served. But even now, I hear the cups and I keep my hands steady. Years have passed, but I still feel the weight of the amphora in my arms. It doesn't matter that my hands now lift nothing heavier than a loaf of bread or a jug of water for myself. The memory sits in my bones, clay warm against my chest, liquid shifting inside, the slow ache rising through my shoulders until it touched the base of my skull. People think it's the blood that stays with you, the blackened sand, the sound of a crowd when the blade goes in. But that's not what wakes me in the night. It's the silence before, the quiet sip, the nod of a man holding his cup as if it were the only steady thing in the world, the last swallow before he steps into light he will not return from. I've forgotten many faces, but never the way they drank. The man who let the wine rest on his tongue, eyes half closed as though memorizing the taste. The one who poured a drop on the ground first, a gift to someone I would never meet. The ones who emptied the cup in a single, defiant gulp. And the ones who barely wet their lips, as if afraid that too much pleasure might weaken them before the fight. Those moments were small, almost invisible in the shadow of what came next, but they are what remain, not the roar, not the death, only the taste, the pause, the weight of what was unsaid. Sometimes I think I stayed as long as I did because I learned to love those silences. They were honest in a way the crowd could never be. There were no lies in the act of drinking when you knew it might be the last thing you did. Even Lucius's final cup, I remember how steady his hands were, how he drank without hurry, even as the wound bled inside him. That steadiness has followed me longer than his death. I still dream of the corridors under the arena, the cool, damp air, the echo of chains against stone. The smell of cork and pitch mingling with the sharper scent of iron. In the dreams, the amphora is always full, and I am always carrying it somewhere I have never been before. The weight never lessens, no matter how far I walk. There are places now where wine is poured for joy, taverns in back streets where men play dice until the lamps burn low. Villas on the coast where guests recline and drink until the moon hangs over the water. I've stood in those places, but I have never lifted a cup there, not because I hate the wine, but because I know it too well. I've seen too many mouths stained by it that would never open again. When I left, I thought I could put the work behind me. But work like that doesn't leave. It shapes your hands, your eyes, your way of seeing the world. Now, whenever I watch someone drink, I find myself reading them the way I once read the men in the preparation chamber. Are they swallowing for thirst, for courage, for memory? And sometimes, though I never say it aloud, I wonder if this is their last cup. The strip of cloth is gone now. I won't say where it went, only that it reached a pair of hands that knew how to read what was sewn into it. Whether it brought salvation or ruin, I'll never know, but I carried it out of the dark, and that has to be enough. The crowd's roar has faded from my mind over the years. What has not faded is the sound of liquid hitting clay, that soft, unbroken ribbon of wine pouring into a cup. It is the one sound I can still hear perfectly, even in silence. When I close my eyes, I can see the amphora tilt, the stream catching the light, the cup filling slowly, steadily, as if there were no rush at all. They say wine is for the living, but I know better, it's for the dying to taste the world one last time. If you're still here, tell me where you're listening from. Somewhere, a stranger will read your words and feel less alone.